Good morning, everybody. We're still adding people, so. Then we'll give everybody just one more minute to come on in and join the webinar. Then we'll get started. All right. Yep. Oh,
I didn't mean to do that. I
gotcha.
was going the wrong way. There we go.
Well, it's 11:01. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to CRI's webinar today. Thank you for attending. We're going to be talking about Domain 2 Ethics and Professionalism of the new Global Internal Audit Standards. And my name is Kevin Black. I'll be your moderator for today. And Doug's Mims is with me, and he'll be presenting on this topic. So just a couple of housekeeping items that we want to go over. Good news that we will be offering a CPE credit of 1 for this webinar in the behavioral ethics field of study. And no partial CPE will be offered for this event. Just everyone make sure that you are signing in with your unique registration email that you use so that you can ensure to receive your CPE credit. And so in order to receive CPE credit, you'll have to respond to 3 of the 4 polling questions. So 75% during the program, we'll have 4 polling questions. I'll go ahead and announce when those are launched, and I'll give you guys and ladies maybe about a minute and a half to answer those. You do not have to answer correctly. They're not subject matter related to receive full credit. Just make sure that you do respond to those, and we'll try to give you ample time and make sure that we track completion of those. Once the webinar is done and we've calculated everything, certificates will be distributed via email about 7 days after today. If you have any questions about the certification process, you can send it to marketing@cricpa.com or send us a chat. The chat function is turned off, but you can send us questions through the Q&A. We have those going on, and we'll answer them accordingly. And then, the PDF, we'll hand that out so that you all can take a look at those slides and have those. We'll access those through the Zoom chat and put them through a Google Drive. And then we'll also post it on CRICPA.com following conclusion of today's webinar. Next slide, please.
Oops, there we go.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, Doug Mims will be presenting today on today's topic. He's a partner in the Atlanta Carr and Ingram office. He leads the financial institutions group along with myself. He's the industry leader for the firm. He's been, doing this type of work for over 30 years, providing insurance and advisory services to financial services companies. And, Doug's also very involved with the Atlanta IA chapter, as well as the KSU, Kennesaw State University Internal Audit Center. And so we're very lucky to have Doug present on this today.
Thank you, Kevin. And Kevin's course, Kevin joined us. He's been with us about 3 months. He has a long storied career in internal audit, and so we're glad to have Kevin as part of our team here in Atlanta. So I know we'll probably have a mixed group on here. Some of you are probably you're external and you may be with a CPA firm. Some of you may be internal auditors, and then there may be some folks internally here from CRI as we offer this to our professionals here at CRI as well. So mixed group, but I'll speak to this from a true internal audit perspective, as if we are all internal auditors and that we're all internal auditors within an organization, because to some degree that's how the standards are written, although they apply to everybody. So today we'll go through in our 50 minutes or hour, we'll go through Global Internal Audit Standards, the new Global Internal Audit Standards, that process, kind of a little bit of an overview. We'll cover Domain 1, the purpose of internal auditing, just kind of have those two to kind of set the stage for Domain 2. And Domain 2 being ethics and professionalism. We'll go through Principle 1 regarding demonstration of integrity, Principle 2, maintaining objectivity, Principle 3, demonstrating competency, Principle 4, exercising due professional care, and Principle 5, maintaining confidentiality. And those are the 5 principles that make up Domain 2. That is the ethics and professionalism aspect of the new Global Internal Audit Standards. And then we'll wrap things up and really say questions at the end, but really we'd prefer you ask them as we go. If you have things that come up, it kind of adds to the course and breaks up the monotony of listening to me ramble, quite frankly. So Global Internal Audit Standards overview. And some of you may or may not know this, but there was quite a effort put forth regarding the Global Internal Audit Standards and updating the international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing, otherwise known as the IPPF. So the IPPF are the standards that have been in place. Specifically, they were updated in 2017. So it had been 7 years since, or it has been 7 years since the last update to the IPPF. And the IIA and the governance structure at IIA felt like it was time to update the standards and bring into update the standards from a global perspective, one, but also from the technology-driven world that we live in, and just the developing business climate since 2017. Obviously, 17 was pre-pandemic, and we're all living in a post-pandemic world now. So there was a 2-year process around the Global Internal Audit Standards and developing them and getting feedback in the process that was gone through. And that culminated in the issuance of a draft document in March of 2023. So we're in 24. So March 2023, there was a draft. There was a comment period for 2 months where a lot of feedback was received, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I do want to point out relative to today's presentation that most everything in here was extracted directly from the Global Internal Audit Standards, and the Global Internal Audit Standards are trademarked by the IIA. All the information contained in here was pulled from there in some way, shape, or form, and it belongs to the IIA, and we are not. They're not ours. They're the IIA's. We're just the conveyors of the information. And I'm not being a good clicker today. Okay, so from an overview and timeline perspective, the survey is, so in the 2-month window, the survey was made available by the IIA in 22 languages. So keeping in mind, particularly if sometimes we forget this about the IIA, it's a global organization, and there's a CIA and other designations. They're global designations. They're not just related to the borders of the United States. So it was put out in 22 languages. There were 1,600 completed surveys that contained 19,000 specific comments. So a robust effort to obtain feedback across the world and inclusive of 22 spoken languages. 69% of the comments actually came from outside North America. So we tend to think that, the United States is the world, sometimes maybe. And quite frankly, over 2/3 of the comments came from outside of the good old U.S. And 25% or 418 of those responses were on behalf of organizations. So that might have been a company like that has an internal audit department, and there was one response as opposed to individual responses. In our instance, I responded, but I responded on behalf of Carr, Riggs and Ingram, LLC. So the final standard was issued on January 9th of this year, and it's applicable, if you will. It has to be adopted in January of 2025. So there was a year provided for transition. So it's perfectly fine right now to be operating under the IPPF, but looking ahead, you need to, come January 1, you need to hit the ground running, having adopted the Global Internal Audit Standards. So hopefully everyone on this call, as applicable, is in that process. As it relates to the process around the Global Internal Audit Standards, there was a report issued, the report on the standard setting and public comment processes for the Global Internal Audit Standards. That's where I extracted some of these statistics. It's actually a quite robust document. So if you're curious about the process and the feedback and so forth, and where the feedback came from, what it looked like, what the breakdown was, that's a great document for that. In fact, I would go ahead and say there's a lot of great tools. The IA has done a really good job of not just putting out the Global Internal Audit Standards, but putting out this accompanying document at the same time. And since that time, other guidance has been put out, and there's guidance. In addition to the full Global Internal Audit Standards, they've put out some reduced verbiage, so that a little bit more digestible, if you will, and other things, comparatives between the IPPF and the new Global Internal Audit Standards, and how they differ, and what that means for internal auditors on a kind of on a blow-by-blow basis. So some very good content that has come out since issuance and continues to come out, not on a daily basis, but certainly frequently. So looking forward to that continued process. So the Global Internal Audit Standards, the fundamentals of the standards are their 15 guiding principles supported by 15 standards. So there's 15 guiding principles within the I think it's five domains, 15 guiding principles supported by 52 standards. We're going to go through a slice of that today. And they're designed to promote conformance and achieve the purpose of internal auditing, which we'll cover in a moment. So a lot of focus in the process and in the guidance around the public interest. So clearly the IIA and the profession views serving the public interest as a priority. And so the public interest encompasses the social and economic interest and overall well-being of society and the organizations operating within that society. So that's kind of an underpinning foundational aspect to the Global Internal Audit Standards, is that they are built to serve the public interest. It is the job of internal auditors, one by one, if you will, as well as collectively, to serve the public interest as defined. Internal auditing plays a critical role in enhancing an organization's ability to serve the public interest, and the IA is committed to setting standards with input from the public and to the benefit of the public. And so that was the goal, and I thought they, just from my own professional opinion, I thought they did a pretty good job with this, actually a really good job. So the fundamentals of the standards continued. The standards apply to any individual or function that provides internal audit services. So whether you're a member of the IA, whether you're a CIA or a CPA or whatever your certification might be, if you provide internal audit services as defined, then the standards apply to you. Again, regardless of what your certifications are, your membership, other things. And so anybody who provides internal audit services, whether an organization employs internal auditors directly, contracts with them through an external service provider, or both. So whatever the scenario, you're doing internal audit, it applies to you. It applies to internal audit departments. It applies to the companies that have internal audit departments. The standards do use the word must in the requirements sections, and everything we go over today is going to be extracted from the requirements sections. It's not the other things, but there's a clear indication of what is required, and this is an enhancement from the draft to the final. There's clarity as to what's required, and then in the other areas, they use words such as should and may, because within each area, there's considerations of for implementation. And underneath that, there's your should and mays. And so it's basically, here's some things to consider. There's also examples of how you might demonstrate you conform. And again, those are the should and the mays, but we're going over today. The things we're going to cover today as it relates to ethics and professionalism are the have tos, things you have to do. And just to further give you a little view of how this is set up. So those are the first two domains. And those are obviously the principles and the standards. And we're gonna cover all those in a few moments, so I won't read through them or anything. But domain one's purpose of internal auditing. Domain two is ethics and professionalism. And then from there is the 5 principles supporting that, which is what we'll cover today. Domain 3 is governing the internal audit function. And so as you can see, there's focus on being authorized by the board. It covers the internal audit mandate, the internal audit charter, as you might expect, as well as the support that is expected from the board and senior management. Principle 7, positioned independently. I know that's near and dear to a lot of internal auditors' hearts in terms of, particularly if you're in an organization, but even if you're an external provider like us, that's an important aspect of what we do. That includes organizational independence, as well as the CAE's qualifications are considered to be relevant in that discussion. Principle 8, overseen by the board, and that covers board interaction, resources, quality, and the external quality assessment. So that's domain 3 and the first and the principle 6, 7, and 8. Domain 4, and I won't go through all these, obviously they're pretty voluminous, but this gets in and starts getting a little more granular here in domain 4 and 5. Domain 4 is managing the internal audit function. So principle 9 is planning strategically, and it addresses things that you might expect, such as internal audit strategy, the methodologies you're going to employ to comply with the standards, as well as the internal audit plan and other coordination and reliance aspects. Managing resources, obviously financial resources are a thing for companies and internal audit departments, as well as when using third-party providers like us. Human resource management, key aspect of it. It's hard to have to do internal audit without good people that are well trained. And then technological resources. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons for the update was the evolving technological world that we live in, and not just from the things that are happening with companies and in the business environment like cybersecurity and all those things, but actually from the internal audit perspective and the use of technology and how you employ technology to carry out your duties. Principle 11 relates to communicating effectively and actually addresses building relationships with and communicating with stakeholders, how you communicate results, errors and omissions, and communicating the acceptance of risks. And then lastly, under managing the internal audit function, principle 12 covers enhancing quality. So that includes the internal quality assessment process, and that didn't actually change a heck of a lot. It's still there and still important. How you measure the performance of the internal audit function, as well as overseeing and the improvement of the individual engagement performance. So that's managing the internal audit function. Domain 5 is probably of a lot of interest to the folks on this webinar, including myself, regarding actually performing internal audit services at the engagement level. Covers planning, engagement communication, risk assessment at the engagement level, defining objectives and scope, evaluation criteria. So what are you auditing to? What's your standard? How are you going to identify conditions, engagement resources, and of course, having a work program. Principle 14 covers conducting engagement work. So goes into gathering information for analysis and, evaluating potential findings, how you evaluate those findings, putting recommendations in place and working with management regarding action plans, as well as wrapping up and making sure that you've documented your work in an appropriate manner. And then principle 15 relates to the communication of engagement conclusions and monitoring action plans. So there are some interesting aspects to that are not the point of our webinar today, but there actually is In the have to section, there are some interesting things in and around reporting findings, working with management to solutions, and actually following and testing remediation. I would say there's some things that in this section that might have been considered previously common practice and even best practice that are now required practice. So it's kind of interesting, but I say that in a positive way, but you obviously need to take a look at it or attend one of our other webinars to dive into that. So as I previously mentioned, each standard includes requirements as well as considerations for implementation and examples of evidence of conformance. I'm getting the drop down. Kevin, do we have anything in the
Yeah, a couple questions. Someone asked, do these standards apply to government and state entities? So I would
Yes,
say yes.
they do.
And then,
Absolutely.
and then we had I'll launch the poll question real quick, and then I'll go through the next question. The other question was,
Kevin, if you
yeah.
would read the poll question and then
Oh,
let's let
yeah.
me answer.
Yeah, no
And
problem.
we'll chill and we'll get to that after we run through do the poll,
Okay.
get everybody's responses.
All right. On a scale of 1 through 5, how are you today? I'm getting a lot of I'm doing wells. It's a mess. We got about 90% or almost there. I'll probably give it another 20 seconds for this last question.
We get 100%?
94%. So 157 of 167. So just missing 10.
Yeah. Come on, 10.
Looks-
You gotta
all right.
answer 3 out of the 4. You only got you don't get but one mulligan. We want everybody to get your CPE credit. It's an investment of time, whether you're listening or not. You gotta pay close enough attention to answer the poll question.
Got one more. All right, last chance, last call for poll question number 1. How are you feeling today? Scale of 1 through 5.
All right, what are we looking like? How's everybody feeling?
Yeah.
What's the results say?
So we got 95%. Let's end this poll. And then so most people are doing well. That's good. We got some best day evers, which I don't know if it's my best day ever, but I'm doing well. I'll tell you that.
All right, good. So we had another, I think another question come in.
Yeah,
Let's
so
see
there's
what we
another
have.
question. I mentioned, so you mentioned, Doug mentioned that if you perform an internal audit function, then the standards apply to you. This only applies if you are stating that you are performing the audit functions under the standards. Is that correct?
No. If you perform internal audit services, they apply to you.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you're conforming with them, but they do apply to you. If you're providing internal audit services, they apply to you. Now, that gets into another area, which is if you want to say in your report that you're complying with the Global Internal Audit Standards, then you need to have a basis for making that statement, meaning you need to be able to demonstrate that you are aligning with the Global Internal Audit Standards. That would typically be done by doing a self-assessment and by conforming with the requirement to have an external assessment done. I think it's once every 5 years. That would be the typical way to support that assertion. But if you're doing internal audit from the IIA's perspective, these standards apply to you.
Good. All right, that's all the questions we had. Yep.
Okay.
I'll take it back to you.
All right. So purpose statement. So hadn't made it to ethics yet. Still giving you the contextual piece of this. So internal audit, the purpose statement of internal audit. Internal auditing strengthens the organization's ability to create, protect, and sustain value by providing the board and management with independent, risk-based, and objective assurance, advice, insight, and foresight. So that's the purpose statement of internal audit from the Global Internal Audit Standards perspective is internal audit strengthens the organization's ability to create, protect, and sustain value. Didn't say anything about auditing, just it talked about value. So internal auditing strengthens the organization's successful achievement of its objectives. So the number one thing internal audit is supposed to do is to assist the organization in achieving its objectives, as well as strengthening governance, risk management, and control processes, decision-making and oversight, reputation and credibility with its stakeholders. And we'll talk a little bit more about stakeholders, because I think sometimes we have a narrow view of stakeholders, and quite frankly, it probably ought to be broader than it is for most folks, myself included, as well as the ability to serve for the company, the ability for the company to serve the public interest. So that's the purpose statement of internal audit, as redefined by the Global Internal Audit Standards. The internal audit is most effective when it's performed by competent professionals in conformance with the Global Internal Audit Standards and are set in the public interest. And the internal audit function is independently positioned with direct accountability to the board. So we've mentioned independently, or I've mentioned independently positioned a couple of times. And for those, I think most folks know what that means, but there's, some folks may not. So just to touch on that for a moment, that means is the audit function positioned in a manner that allows them to be objective? Or are they reporting up through management possibly, and let's say they're reporting through management and they're auditing things that also report to that same management person, and there is no direct line to the audit committee? Is that a preferable situation? Typically, the answer would be no. So if you have that situation, please don't go back and say I said you're in a bad situation. But generally, the preferred positioning would be a direct line to the audit committee and a dotted line to someone in executive management that allows the function to have accountability as part of the company and from an administrative perspective, but allows the audit function to do what it needs to do without any barriers. And then lastly, internal auditors are free from undue influence and committed to making objective assessments. So I think that's the last slide as it relates to the purpose statement. Okay. So
hey, Doug, quick question. Another one came up before we dive into domain 2. Someone asked, if the auditor doesn't follow GAS, generally accepted audit standards, they can be prohibited from opining on financial statements. Do you know if the IA is doing something to enforce those claiming to provide internal audit services to comply with global internal audit standards?
I've not seen anything regarding enforcement. And that is a little different in that when you have an auditor that's that's opining on GAS, there is a structure in place. Those firms are members of the AICPA, they're members of their state societies. They are members of their state boards of accountancy, which is where that actually gets enforced, if I'm not mistaken. And so there is an infrastructure there that drives accountability. There is no infrastructure that drives that level of accountability as it relates to the Global Internal Audit Standards, but also there wasn't one with the IPPF either. So to some degree, it's a professional obligation to conform as opposed to a statute to perform, but that could change at some point in time. So just for me, I'm just saying I'm not aware of any enforcement structure.
Yep, neither am I.
Was that is there anything else? Any other questions? It dropped down, so I can't tell if it's.
That was it.
Okay. All right, good. All right. So domain 2, ethics and professionalism. So the domain 2 replaces the former code of ethics that was an accompanying part of the IPPF. It applies to all individuals and entities providing internal audit services. I think I've said that a couple times. The CAE is expected to support and promote conformance. One thing I think you'll see throughout the Global Internal Audit Standards, but in particular what we're discussing today, is that it's the CAE, Chief Audit Executive, and I'll say this too, Chief Audit Executives, whoever's in charge of internal audit. It could be the audit director, it could be the audit manager, they might be called the internal auditor. Heck, it might be just the internal auditor. It might be just one person. At the end of the day, whoever is the head of audit, and I'll use that CAE acronym going forward, but it's their job to create an environment and a culture that promotes ethics and professionalism and compliance with the standard. And you'll see that embedded in some of the slides as we go through them. So, and then lastly, conformance provides the basis for reliance on internal auditors' work and judgment. So conforming with the domain 2, ethics and professionalism, provides the basis for others to place reliance on internal audit. So within this, we'll go, that's domain 2 overview, and then principle 1, demonstrate integrity. Within principle 1 is standard 1.1, honesty and professional courage. So internal auditors demonstrate integrity in their work and behavior. Internal auditors must perform their work with honesty and professional courage. And we'll talk about professional courage as we go, but as you might imagine, that relates to conveying what needs to be conveyed, even if it's not positive. But internal auditors must be truthful, accurate, clear, open, and respectful in all professional relationships and communications, even when expressing skepticism or offering an opposing viewpoint. Internal auditors must not make false, misleading, or deceptive statements, nor conceal or omit findings or other pertinent information. So basically, the way I summarize that is you have to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. You got to, get it all out there and say what needs to be said, but do it in a professional manner and do it as respectfully as you can, but do say what needs to be said and report what needs to be reported. Continuing with standard 1.1, internal auditors must disclose all material facts known to them that, if not disclosed, could affect the organization's ability to make well-informed decisions, because ultimately what we report, management has to then decide what they're going to do with it, right? Are they going to address it? How are they going to address it? What resources? What's the timeline? All those things. Internal auditors must exhibit courage by communicating truthfully and taking appropriate action, even when confronted by dilemmas and difficult situations. So if you're on here and you're an internal auditor, you know exactly what this is talking about. If you're on here and you're a financial statement auditor, you might not know so much about that, because it's not a routine part of the process. The process in a financial statement audit is to opine. Do we issue, what we call internal control findings or a management letter? We do. And if you are involved in that process and you've experienced the pushback that comes with reporting that management letter comment, then that's what we're talking about. But basically, in an internal audit scenario, it happens routinely, because that's the nature of internal audit, is to define the criteria, audit to the criteria. And if you find a condition that's different, if you find a status that's different than that, then you have a condition that you report. And so it's a normal recurring part of the internal audit process. The CAE must maintain a work environment where internal auditors feel supported when expressing legitimate, evidence-based engagement results, whether favorable or unfavorable. So whoever's in charge of audit, whether that's the CAE or in a firm, that's me, when it's my team, they need to have your back. We go through the process, we identify the issue, we communicate it with management, we vet it, what I call vetting the issue with management, make sure our facts are straight, try to work through it. But at the end of the day, the CAE needs to have the back and needs to support the internal auditor. So moving on to standard 1.2, organization's ethical expectations. So this is the organization's ethical expectations under the idea that the internal auditor is in the organization, not just the internal audit department. Internal auditors must understand, respect, meet, and contribute to the legitimate and ethical expectations of the organization and be able to recognize conduct that is contrary to those expectations. Internal auditors must encourage and promote an ethics-based culture in the organization. If internal auditors identify behavior within the organization that is inconsistent with the organization's ethical expectations, they must report the concern according to applicable policies and procedures. The way I take this is there's a higher bar as it relates to ethics for the internal auditor from the Global Internal Audit Standards perspective. The internal auditor needs to be a cheerleader, if you will, for ethical expectations, a supporter of ethical conformity with ethical expectations, and also needs to be, to some degree, if you identify areas where it's not being held, people aren't meeting the standard, then you need to have a mechanism for addressing that. But the folks that are not in internal audit need to meet the ethics standard, and it's not their job necessarily to be a cheerleader, a promoter, a fan, but they need to meet those standards. Internal audit needs to do more, is the way I interpret this. Standard 1.3, legal and ethical behavior. Internal auditors must not engage in or be a party to any activity that is illegal or discreditable, so not just illegal, but also discreditable to the organization or the profession of internal audit, or that may harm the organizations or its employees. So internal auditors need to conduct themselves in a manner that not only aligns with the law, but also things that could be perceived as being discreditable to their employer or to the profession of internal audit. Internal auditors must understand and abide by relevant laws or regs relevant to the industry and jurisdiction in which the organization operates, and including making any disclosures as required. And if internal auditors identify legal or regulatory violations, they must report such incidents to whomever is appropriate. Could be an individual, to entities. It could be, quite frankly, to law enforcement, depending on the nature of the item. So that's standard 1.3, legal and ethical behavior. All right, to another poll question.
All right. Poll question number 2 has been launched. Are you attending the webinar for CPE credit? These are coming in fast. All right, so we got 80% so far.
I think we're going to find out by who's attending for CPE credit by the number of responses. You know, if they don't
Yeah.
respond, they might not be, or they might not be getting credit, right?
Yeah, not yet. Not yet. We got 13 with no so far. About 93%. So we just got 10 more out there. So give you all another chance, another 20 seconds to answer this poll question. I got 94%, just 9 left. I think I'll close this one and share the results now. All right, so but you should be able to see the results. 91% say yes. No, 9%.
Good. Okay. Well, if they're CPAs, they need ethics training. Most states are required, and if they're CIAs, I think, is it 2 hours every 2 years? Maybe, I can't remember. I always have to check, but okay. So principle 2 is maintain objectivity. So standard 2.1 relates to individual objectivity. So this is talking about the internal auditor, not the internal audit function. Internal auditors maintain an impartial and unbiased attitude when performing internal audit services and making decisions. Internal auditors must maintain professional objectivity when performing all aspects of internal audit services. Professional objectivity requires internal auditors to apply an impartial and unbiased mindset and make judgments based on balanced assessment of relevant circumstances. So individual objectivity comes back to being impartial, managing your bias, making balanced assessments, meaning considering all relevant information and circumstances and trying to come to a conclusion. And quite frankly, that's probably easier said than done sometimes, but that is individual objectivity and professional objectivity as defined at the individual person level as it relates to professional objectivity from the Global Internal Audit Standards perspective. And internal auditors must be aware of and manage potential biases. And I think obviously we all have biases based on our lives. We're all from different places, different families, different regions, different schools, different whatevers. And there's always a bias in there that you may or may not recognize you have. Standard 2.2, safeguarding objectivity. Internal auditors must recognize and avoid or mitigate actual, potential, and perceived impairments to activity. So it's the internal auditor's responsibility to be aware and seek to recognize. Because if you don't recognize it, you can't address it. If you recognize it, then you can go through the process and determine what's appropriate. Internal auditors must not accept any tangible or intangible items such as a gift, reward, or favor that may impair or be presumed to impair objectivity. So I thought this was pretty tightly worded, and there's similar language in the AICPA guidance regarding independence for financial statement auditors, if you will, but no tangible or intangible. You can't, not even a favor that might not only might impair, but that it might give the appearance of impairment. So a very, very, very narrow path there as it relates to internal auditors' objectivity. Internal auditors must avoid conflicts of interest and must not be unduly influenced by their own interest or the interests of others, including senior management or others in a position of authority, or by the political environment or other aspects of their surroundings. So I would say an example of that would be going back to positioning in the organization. If your boss is the CFO and you're doing an internal audit of a business process that reports directly to the CFO, and they are seeking to manage outcome, and I know nobody in your organization would do that. None of our clients would ever do that, of course. That's a joke. They're trying to manage outcome. And so that gets kind of tough. So that's really what that's talking about is trying to avoid being unduly influenced in such a scenario. Standard 2.2, safeguarding objectivity continued. Internal auditors must refrain from assessing specific activities for which they were previously responsible. Objectivity is presumed to be impaired if an internal auditor provides assurance services for an activity for which the internal auditor had responsibility within the last 12 months. So what that means is if you're an internal auditor in an organization and there is an auditable unit, if you will, that you previously had responsibility for, then you are presumed to not be objective as it relates to assurance services. And for the CPA types on here, that's not the same assurance service that we're talking about over in gas. This is what I would categorize as your normal ongoing operational, financial, and compliance control assessments that take place. In other words, it's not a consulting engagement. It is designed to provide feedback on governance, risk, and control. So if you're providing an assurance service, internal audit in your organization, you're presumed not to be objective if you were responsible for it within the last 12 months. If the internal audit function is to provide assurance services where it had previously performed advisory services. So previously provided consulting services. So that might have included evaluating and helping management maybe assess and design internal controls, right? It could be design, it could have been an informal assessment, it could have been feedback, but you were somehow had your hands in this in some other manner other than assurance. So if the internal audit function is to provide assurance services where it had previously performed advisory services, the CAE must confirm that the nature of the advisory services doesn't impair objectivity and must assign resources such that individual objectivity is managed. So it could be that the CAE determines that the person who did the consulting engagement doesn't need to be on this engagement, and structure it differently, have different personnel, whatever. But that is part of the management and safeguarding objectivity. Assurance engagements over which the CAE has responsibility must be overseen by an independent party outside the internal audit function. Because let's face it, if you're an internal audit director, CAE, it's not completely uncommon for you to have other functions in your organization that report up to you. Hopefully they're not operational or financial reporting. Hopefully they're more support services like possibly, ERM or compliance or something like that. But nonetheless, the internal audit function is not objective if that area reports up to the CAE per standard 2.2. Continuing with standard 2.2, if internal auditors are to provide advisory services related to activities for which they had previous responsibility, they must disclose any potential impairments to the party requesting the engagement. So a consulting engagement / advisory where a manager has asked internal audit to do a consulting engagement, if you will, there needs to be full disclosure about the fact that if someone involved actually had oversight responsibility in that area before. So again, just a disclosure item here, because it's not an assurance service, and it may be okay, but just want to be transparent about the people involved and the nature of the work. And hey, Kevin, the chat's dropping down. Is there anything in there we need to? I don't know if that's our folks dropping trap bombs in
Someone
there.
had, I'm answering it privately.
Okay.
Someone had raised their hand. I'm just making sure that they have a question to let me know.
All right. The CAE must establish methodologies to address impairments to objectivity. Internal auditors must discuss impairments and take appropriate actions according to the relevant methodology. So a lot of emphasis around objectivity and making sure that internal audit and internal auditors are in a position to be objective when providing assurance services. Disclosing impairments to objectivity. If objectivity is impaired in fact or appearance, the details of the impairment must be disclosed to the appropriate parties. If internal auditors become aware of an impairment that may affect their objectivity, they must disclose it to the CAE or designated supervisor. So there needs to be, just again, transparency around objectivity. This is in a case where you actually have impairments that are known, or they could be impairments that provide the appearance of an impairment. I probably screwed that all up. You need to raise your hand and you need to report it to the CAE. And then there needs to be a process as defined in the internal audit methodology as to how that gets addressed. If an impairment that affects the reliability or perceived reliability of the engagement findings, recommendations, or conclusion is discovered after the fact, the CAE must discuss it with management of the activity and then escalate that discussion to the senior management or the board or other stakeholders as deemed appropriate. And lastly, on disclosing impairments, if the CAE is impaired in fact or appearance, they must disclose that impairment to the board. So that's not a may or should, that's a have to. All right. Third poll question. I think it's third. Isn't this the third?
Yep, third.
All right, we're
Question
down to
number
11
3.
minutes, so we'll pick up the pace on this one and in general.
Yeah. Are you still there? They're coming in hot. Looks like most people are. 3 are not there. And just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, be sure to submit through the Q&A rather than raise your hand or and then I know that you do not have access to chat, so please submit those in the Q&A and we'll take a look and address those. All right, we got 45 seconds in. We'll go about 30 more seconds left. We got 91 participated so far, so 14 more of you out there looking for a response to the poll question.
All right, let's close her down. We got to make sure we get to the fourth poll question. So let's
Yep.
close her down and move on.
All righty. Poll's closed. You can go ahead.
All right. So principle 3 is demonstrate competency. Standard 3.1 competency. Internal auditors apply the knowledge, skills, and abilities to fulfill their roles and responsibilities successfully. So internal auditors must possess or obtain the competencies to perform their responsibilities successfully. You don't have to have the skill set, but if you don't, you have to have a path to obtain it. And the required competencies include things like the knowledge, skills, and abilities suitable for one's job and position and responsibilities, commensurate with the level of experience. And at the end of the day, the internal auditor has to have appropriate knowledge of the Global Internal Audit Standards, and internal auditors must engage only in those services for which they have or can attain the necessary competencies. So that's kind of intuitive, but if you don't have the knowledge and experience, then you need to raise your hand and determine what needs to take place. Continuing with competency, each internal auditor is responsible for continually developing and applying the competencies necessary to fulfill their professional responsibilities, which includes things like training. So additionally, the CAE must ensure that the internal audit function collectively possesses the competencies to perform internal audit services commensurate with the charter. So as an individual, you're responsible for having the competency to fulfill your professional responsibility. And from the CAE's perspective, they're responsible for making sure the function can meet the expectations as defined in the internal audit charter and the methodologies. 3.2, this is the one that relates to CPE. In the draft, there was actually a specific CPE requirement, but internal auditors must maintain and continually develop their competencies to improve their effectiveness, etc. And internal auditors must pursue CPE, including education and training. So, and it goes on to say that if you have a certain certification, then you need to meet those CPE requirements. But obviously, if you're a CIA or a CPA or a CISA or whatever you are, obviously you have to do that in order to maintain your certification. Okay, principle 4 is exercise due professional care. Standard 4.1, conformance with the standards. So internal auditors must plan and perform internal audit services in accordance with the Global Internal Audit Standards. As you might imagine, that's a must. The internal audit functions methodologies must be established, documented, and maintained in alignment with the standards. And internal auditors must follow the standards and the functions methodologies when planning and performing internal audits. So everybody's required to comply with the Global Internal Audit Standards and or to perform in accordance with the Global Internal Audit Standards, and the functions methodologies need to align with the standards, and then everybody needs to follow the methodology. So pretty clear on standard 4.1. Standard 4.2, due professional care. Couple things to point out. I won't go through this whole list for the sake of time, but internal auditors need to exercise due professional care by assessing the nature, circumstances, and requirements of the services they're providing. A couple of points of interest here to me is the second bullet, the interest. So most of this are things you would expect. So it would be, adequacy of governance, risk, and controls, and others. But a couple in here that I would point out under due professional care would be the interest for those whom the internal audit services are provided and the interests of other stakeholders. So part of applying due professional care is considering the interest of the auditee and considering the interest of other stakeholders. Another one that I thought was of interest would be cost in relation to potential benefits. And the way I interpret that is, if the cost of doing the work exceeds the benefit, then you probably ought to reconsider your approach, whether or not you should be doing the audit or how much time you plan to spend in it. Because as part of exercising due professional care, you should consider that criteria, which is makes sense. Standard 4.3, professional skepticism, maintaining an attitude that includes inquisitiveness, critically assessing the reliability of information, being straightforward and honest when raising concerns and asking questions about inconsistent information, and seeking additional evidence to make judgments about information that might otherwise seem incomplete or inconsistent or false. So that would be professional skepticism. It doesn't mean that you assume everybody is a crook. That is not what it means. It doesn't mean that you assume everything you do that you're going to look at is incorrect or needs to be modified or whatever. But it does mean be inquisitive, critically assess information, be straightforward and honest, and seek appropriate evidence when you're not certain that the evidence that you're looking at supports the position you're taking. All right, poll question 4. We get to at 11:56. We get to poll question 4, so we're good. Hey, Kevin, I think you're muted unless
Yeah, apologies.
Okay.
Poll question number 4. Have you followed at CRI CPA on social media? So LinkedIn, Instagram. What else we got? Facebook.
So one thing I would say to everybody, if you're in the organization, certainly I hope you follow us, but we have a robust presence on social media. We're on all the primary platforms. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn. Our marketing team does a great job of getting information out there. And it also, if you follow us, it allows you, we have a lot of great CPE that's a lot better than having to listen to me ramble for 50 minutes. There's a lot of good stuff out there for both internally and externally to follow. And we certainly invite you to follow us. We're also on X. But LinkedIn's a great way to follow. So a lot of information. All of our events go out there, and it also follow our portfolio companies. We have 8 portfolio companies that do a lot of different things, and we're a dynamic financial services company, and we'd love for you to follow us.
All right, we have about 92%, so just 12 more left. I can leave it up if we want to continue, Doug.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably what we should have done last time, is just moved on but left it up so they could grab that CPE. So principle 5 is maintaining confidentiality. And so standard 5.1, use of information. And the gist of this is internal auditors should not improperly use information, whether for personal gain or in any manner other than to support the internal audit activity. And that's the gist of standard 5.1. Protection of information. Internal auditors must be aware of their responsibilities to protect information. Most companies have processes in place for that, so you need to abide by those to the extent they're sufficient. We certainly do. Every other company and bank and whatnot that we work with does. So internal auditors need to be aware of their responsibilities and act in a manner that demonstrates respect for confidentiality and privacy. We do a lot of work with banks. We see a lot of information that doesn't need to be shared elsewhere, and we don't need to lose it, and we don't need to have our laptop stolen and other things. So protection of that information is important from a variety of perspectives. Or if you're like us, we do know before me training, and then I don't click on a link or do anything. Even I'm afraid to read my email for roughly 3 months after that. So standard 5.2 again, protecting information, consideration specific to the audit function, custody and retention and disposal of engagement records, release of engagement records to other parties, handling of access to or copies of confidential information when no longer needed. So really, there's nothing in standard 5 about protecting information. There's nothing unusual that's outside of what we all would operate in as part of a typical business or firm. And internal auditors should not disclose information to third parties, and they should make every reasonable effort to protect information. And the CAE should ensure that policies and processes are in place to ensure that, in fact, is the environment in which the internal audit function operates. So with that, we hit 12 o'clock. We're also on YouTube. I didn't say YouTube. I said all the rest, and we're not on, was it Threads? I don't go on there, but that's a compliment to Instagram, but we're on there as well. So please follow us. But again, I'm Doug Mims, partner in the Atlanta office. Please reach out if we can ever help you. If you're part of the our organization, that goes for you as well. If we can ever be of assistance, Kevin's here, senior management in Atlanta, and we do internal audit every day. Hopefully we do it well, but we know for sure we do it. So thank you all for investing your time with us today. I know you could have done something else. And if you needed ethics CPE, I hope you'd answered 4 poll questions so you get it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. And thanks for joining us.